across groups. But I think it's safe to say that on all of the data that I'm presenting, younger people are more positive than older people about immigration, women slightly more than men, and then there's this political divide that James mentioned. So a lot of the data I'm going to be presenting is from the Immigration Tracker Survey, which British Future does with Ipsos, and it's been done in 14 waves since 2015. The last wave was last summer, and the next wave is going to be this summer. Also going to be talking about a couple of other surveys as well. So, I think James has really just said this, that now we've had big change in attitudes since just before the referendum, in attitudes on the impact of immigration. So more people who responded to the survey see immigration, the impact of immigration as positive rather than negative. So almost half of people now see immigration as having a positive impact. And that's a big change since 2015. And 29% see it as negative, which was more like 40-something% in 2015. So big changes there. And then support for reducing immigration numbers is now at its lowest level. So still, it's 42%. It's not that small, but 42% of people would like to see immigration reduced. 26% the same, and 24% increased. And so the proportion of people who want it reduced and the proportion of people who want it increased in that survey is the largest ever over time. So big changes in attitudes then. And James just mentioned this, that really over time, really since 1990 and onwards, right up until the referendum, you had this is around salience. This isn't about attitudes as such, but when people asked what are the most important issues facing the UK, up until the referendum, numbers of migrants increased alongside concerns. I'm not saying the two necessarily related, but what we have since then, interestingly, is that numbers of migrants have gone up. This is something that Jonathan's commented on a lot. But salience has gone down, except, as James said, it has appeared more recently in the Ipsos issues index. And I'm guessing that's more about asylum seekers and small boats than it is about economic migration. So, concerns about COVID and the economy have really taken over on attitudes and on the issues index in particular. So we've asked a series of questions in the tracker. This is a different slide. So I think the interesting thing is that people don't realise that this has happened. And certainly my Guardian reading friends, when I say to them that this is the case, that people are now more positive, they're stunned. This isn't something that they know about. But you can see from this data that most people think that their friends and family have kept sort of similar views, but they believe that most of the public has actually got more negative about immigration, which, as we've seen, is not the case. People are a bit more divided on the media, and it's there that you see more political divides in that Labour supporters feel that the media is more negative, and on politicians, again, Labour supporters feel that politicians or members of Parliament are more negative than positive. So, but what seems to have happened is that attitudes towards migration for work have had quite a big shift and have been very influential on attitude change. So we've included a series of questions about migration for work in the immigration tracker. We've asked this one in a couple of waves of the tracker. So we chose these conditions under which employers could recruit migrants because basically they're ones in which there's no clear provision, or there was no clear provision within the points-based system. And obviously there is a seasonal worker scheme, and now there's a hospitality scheme. But when we first asked this question, there wasn't a special scheme. Sorry, not for hospitality, for health and social care. So things have changed a little bit. We were quite surprised at the level of support for this kind of provision for employers to recruit from outside the UK. So for seasonal temporary work, it's 2/3. Key services such as health and social care, 77%. And although I said there's differences by age, with older people generally being more negative, actually those two types of migration were more strongly supported by older people, Possibly they knew more about fruit picking, maybe they'd done it themselves. And maybe it's because they're more frequent users of health and social care. But anyway, there was no real age divide. In fact, it was more in the other direction. And then for lower skilled workers that are hard to recruit, harder to recruit by employers, the majority of people would support that. And as we heard earlier, a key part of the points-based system is to reduce, to make it more difficult for employers to recruit lower skilled workers by having a system that has a skills threshold. But that doesn't seem to be supported by the majority of people. And then there's this question for any job where there are shortages in the UK, and that also is very high. So, and then we did ask about specific occupations. So I think Madeline mentioned this morning that when you ask about specific occupations, that's often more meaningful to people. But here you also have, the responses of people also suggest a kind of break with this idea that people really support high-skilled migration and don't support low-skilled migration. And I think that phrase was included in the white paper, from what I remember, that we're drawing up this new points-based system because the British public have given us a strong message that they don't want low-skilled migration. Not really the case when you ask people directly about particular sectors and occupations. And so we have here doctors and nurses. Predictably, the majority of people would like to have increases in those immigration of those particular workers. But then we see fruit and vegetable pickers, quite high proportions there, care home workers, and even restaurant and catering staff, all of which are quite difficult to recruit via the points-based system. Construction labourers, support starts to be a little lower, and sorry, any academics here, only 30%. And yes, so I was going to say, really, this is around social value, obviously with the exception of academics, and economic need. But what it's not really about, responses to this question and the earlier one, it's not really about high skill, low skill, that people have often said it was. So why have attitudes changed? Big question. Very difficult to answer because I think there's probably been a lot going on. We did include a question and we asked people, if you changed your mind about immigration, why is that? And we gave them these options. I have to say that the numbers here start to get small because the overall sample size was 3,206, and 22% of people said their attitudes had changed, even though clearly more than a higher percentage had actually changed their minds. But these are the people who said, yes, I've become more positive. The top reason you can see here is that they've become more aware about the role of migrants in key services such as health and social care during the pandemic. And then I think, so the majority of people who said they'd become more positive said that. And that's in a way not surprising because people were aware through TV, other media coverage, and also in their daily lives through delivery workers, through when they went into hospital and so on. They were made very aware that quite a few of those workers who were supporting the pandemic effort were migrants. And then the second answer is somewhat related. So this is around discussions since the vote to leave have highlighted how much immigrants contribute to the UK. So that's partly a kind of pandemic question. It's around, we did have much more discussion about immigration during the referendum and since, and that gave people a chance to reflect. And then the third reason was around control. So the idea that the UK has now more control over migration since we left the EU and the end of free movement. And we do find in another question on the tracker, which I haven't presented here, is that when you ask people if they prefer a system that exercises control, even if that means numbers increase, or whether you prefer a system that restricts numbers, people go for control much more than numbers, by about 42 or 44% to 20%. So for some people, control is important here. And then some people believe that fewer migrants are coming to the UK. Wrong, obviously. Although in another question, people are generally aware that migration has increased in certain categories. And then there's the thing, I personally know more people, and that's very likely, and I'm going to say something about that in a minute. And then there's people are concerned about, they're less concerned about the arrival of asylum seekers, and I think that's probably changed now, because this was a year ago, before the small boats issue became much more current. And then I hear fewer negative stories in the media. So anyway, that gives us an idea. So I mentioned the kind of social value, economic worth, and we included this question. This was actually done by Focal Data for us. And so we did a survey in 2012 when we were founded, and it included a lot of questions about migration, race, integration, people's attitudes to the UK and so on, life in the UK. And so this is one of the questions that we asked. And we said, which of these statements do you agree with? And so the first one was, immigration to Britain will make no difference to Britain's economic recovery. Immigration to Britain will damage economic recovery by taking away jobs from people living here. And then immigrant skills and labour are necessary to help Britain's economic recovery. In 2012, the majority of people felt that immigration would damage economic recovery by taking jobs away from British workers. Scroll on to 2022, exactly the reverse. So now the majority of people think that immigrant skills and labour are necessary to help Britain's economic recovery. So a big change there. So I'm just going to say a little bit, I don't know how much time I've got. This is not very, I'm just warning you, this is not terribly robust. But I've been quite struck by two things. First of all, people saying they know more migrants than in the past. And we also know through social contact theory that where people have positive contact or meaningful contact with people not like themselves, they become more positive. And we do know that migration since 2004 has become much more dispersed. So Eastern European migrants in particular went everywhere in the UK. There is no local authority in the UK that doesn't have an Eastern European living there. Even the Isles of Scilly has 30 Eastern Europeans living there. I don't know why they're there. And Anglesey as well has, so everywhere in the UK, they went everywhere. But also other new migrants are moving to atypical destinations. So at British Future, we've been doing research funded by the Department for Levelling Up about settlement and integration of people from Hong Kong. And they're moving to really different locations to previous migrants. They're moving to the suburbs, driven by interest in high-performing schools, in areas with low crime, areas that are good cost of living wise. So what this means, and I think Ukrainians also, obviously for different reasons, are living all over the UK. So what this means is that people are having much more contact with migrants. So I had a look at the census data, and I looked at where Eastern Europeans were, and then I matched it with data from the British election study, which has been mapped by Owen Winter at Bristol University. And I was interested in this because his maps, so he's produced these amazing maps, and this is at local authority level. And this is around whether people would like levels of migration, whether they like way fewer migrants or many more. And so you can see the chart is quite dark for 2016 with a dark brown. The darker the brown, the fewer migrants people would like. This is the median score for each of those areas. And I think on the 2016, you can't see any green, not even a pale green. So everywhere is kind of 5 or less. London is the highest, and some parts of Scotland. Scroll through to 2022, and what a change. So you do have some areas in London and also in Scotland, and also kind of scattered around where people would like more migrants. So that's a big change. So in terms of Owen's findings, and this is before I say kind of what I found when I kind of matched it with the data on Eastern Europeans. I did it on Eastern Europeans because they're everywhere, and also because they're a much more controversial group of migrants for people in terms of attitudes. So we know that from work that was done around the time of the referendum, particularly qualitative research. So Owen's research finds that in 2016, the average median score, in terms of fewer migrants more, is 2.4. 2022, the average median score is 4. And in 2022, the highest median score was of 6 was the highest. 10 out of 11 of those are London. I should also say, actually, I excluded Scotland and Wales when I did this, because just for ease, because it was quite difficult to match the local authorities. It was not an easy process. But interestingly, all except one of the 28 local authorities that scored a 0 in 2016, pretty low obviously, had moved to 3. So that's a big change. Now, when I matched this with the census data, when I matched the election survey data with the census data, I found that in both 2000 and 2022, there's a small positive relationship between the presence of Eastern Europeans and attitudes. But when I looked at the change in attitudes between those 2 points, I found that there was a small positive relationship between the percentage of Eastern Europeans and attitude change if you took out London. And I think the reason for that is that London was already positive, as you could see, fairly positive. And so you have less far to go if you're already positive. But what I think is actually is most interesting. So this morning, Donald Houston also mentioned the kind of geographical difference or geographical differences in attitude. And he mentioned some areas with high Eastern Europeans, and Catherine's team also have looked at Great Yarmouth. And Donald made a point. He said that he thinks sort of local dynamics are probably quite important. So I think there's kind of a lot going on. So to kind of support that, the biggest shift does include areas with quite a high percentage of Eastern European migrants, such as Boston, which is near Great Yarmouth, has 13% of migrants, Peterborough, 9%, and also Southampton and Watford. So those areas had quite a big shift. They've also had quite a lot of change, but probably not that much change since 2016, but certainly leading up to 2016. So I hope to do a bit more on that, and I'm very interested in discussions with anyone who wants to look at that in more detail. So conclusions, just a few conclusions to make, and like James has really. So attitudes are moving in a positive direction, at least for migration for work. And so, but lack of recognition of that is a puzzle. It's a challenge for people like employers that want to recruit, and also for others, particularly when government policy claims to be in support of public opinion. And positive attitudes actually extend to lower skilled work. And so social value and economic necessity are as important as skill. And in terms of attitude change, the pandemic and also post-Brexit recovery and discussion seem to be factors in people's attitude change. So I think overall concerns about the economy have eclipsed those about migration. But I think they haven't just replaced them. It'd be a mistake to say, oh, people are now interested or worried about the economy and they're no longer worried about migration. I think the point is they've absorbed them. And so that migration is actually seen now as necessary for economic growth. Migration is seen positively in terms of economic recovery. And I also think that migration has been normalised socially as well as economically. So, you know, most people have a migrant present in their life, in their workplace, at the school, socially, in their communities. So there's that social contact which has made a difference. But I think it's not all rosy, obviously, as we heard from the previous session. And immigration does remain a contentious issue, but I think particularly in relation to asylum seekers and refugees.